Well, Kyle's the expert on it. Because he's the one that went first. You defined the palette.
And then I like you too.
All right.
So, is it agreed that that is the correct order?
I feel like
By everyone who
if
says?
you do like no, number 3, number 2, or not. Okay, yeah.
Okay, is that good? Alright, sorry to lie to you guys, but it really doesn't matter what order you chose. What we're trying to show is, what we're trying to do is look at the ethics in experimentation, and what we're trying to show is if you guys would volunteer subjects, or if you guys would force subjects, such as your friend over here, who is made to come up here and do this. So we're trying to, is this an ethical action? You guys had no idea how spicy these hot sauces were. These hot sauces, for all you know, they could have put it on their tongue, and their tongue could have melted away because it was acid or something. You guys didn't know. That's an exaggeration, of course, but you guys truly didn't know. You guys were just told that you needed to rank them in order for your grade, and you guys were willing to make one person come up here as a mandatory to figure it out. I mean,
do you actually know the order? Is there like a way to measure it? I don't know. I've never tried.
There is a way to.
Take a spoonful of it and decide later. But yeah, so what we're trying to look at was it ethical was this activity ethical or not? To have some people subjected to pain for the knowledge for the rest of you, for the greater good or whatnot. This is a question for you guys. What do you think this was an ethical action? Okay.
I feel like yes, to a sense, like if they're willing to like volunteer to like go and like get hurt because people just don't mind pain, then yeah. But if they're like one of those people that's like, all right, no, then you shouldn't have to force them.
So do you guys think it would have been any less ethical if you guys were to if you guys were to force someone to come up here?
I mean, if we forced Yasmin to come up here, well, obviously because it's against their. I mean, if they didn't want to, yeah, it's probably not.
So, during the activity, did any of you guys actually think about what pain the tasters might have been in? Did it matter to you guys?
No.
No? Okay. So, the focus to our presentation is going to be: at what point does the value of knowledge surpass the value of a human life? So we're going to be looking at some real life situations and show some points where we think experiments might have gone too far, and we'll be looking at what it is that they did that is specifically ethically wrong. Okay? So we'll start off with some approaches to ethics. There are 4 main approaches, and the first 2 are usually deontological and consequentialist. Deontological was referenced by another presentation, I believe it was yesterday's presentation, and it's that an action is either ethically correct or ethically incorrect all of the time. There's no gray area. It's not like the law. There's no judging. It's either right or wrong. And this was a philosopher named Immanuel Kant was one that believed in this approach to ethics, and he believed in what was called universal principles. If everyone in the world did this action, would we be fine, or do you think it would be sort of harmful to live in this sort of world? And then the consequentialist approach was what it is that it's more evaluative, it's more subjective. You're actually measuring the situation to see if the action was ethical or not. For example, it might be wrong to just push a person to the ground, but if there was a car coming at them and you push them out of the way, that's not quite wrong. It can't be considered wrong in the same way. So the other 2 would be teleological and utilitarian, which are somewhat similar but not quite the same as the other 2 approaches. Teleological has it's based off of what's called a telos, which is an ultimate purpose. So all processes are justified by the result they are wishing to meet. Then, so for example, ethical actions are those that seek to promote the human species. So only those actions that promote the growth of the human species are those that are considered ethical. Or the utilitarian is the action that benefits the most people, is the one that is most ethically sound. That's the most ethically correct. And this was believed by John Stuart Mill, who believed in a greater good, which is a common thought nowadays, I think. And the question he kept in mind to judge an action would be, what is the most useful course of actions? And so,
all right, so we also have to look at subjectivity and objectivity in terms of how we determine ethical situations. So in terms of subjectivity, it's basically up to the person themselves, the individual, to decide whether something's ethical and how they apply the four schools of thought in terms of ethics that Luis just talked about. Basically, that there is no general ethical code that exists. It's up to the individual to decide for themselves what's right or wrong, using various ways of knowing, such as reasoning and intuition. In terms of objectivity, there are people that believe that there are universal laws and universal codes of ethics that people have to follow. So we can look now, like, I think most of us would objectively agree that killing is wrong, per se, but when you apply like a subjectivist view, you can say like, okay, but what about in defense, or what about in certain situations? All right, so our first real life example is Dr. Mengelé's Nazi experiments. So during the Nazi regime, it was promoted that what were considered invalids by the Aryan officials were to be experimented on and tortured and just various, like what we consider now inhumane activities. So this particular example is one of where Dr. Mengele was experimenting on a family of Jewish dwarves, and he wanted to see if a genetic link existed between dwarfism. So I'm going to read you this quote. Both his parents were of normal height, but he had a dwarf grandfather and 7 dwarf aunts and uncles. Thus Mengele was eager to learn his genetic destiny. Because the veins in the infant's arms were too narrow for extraction, he had blood drawn from his fingers and from behind his ears. So obviously there are clear violations of human rights that we can see right now, that we hold as values. But what do you guys think is meant by genetic destiny in this quote?
Maybe he's trying to see how the family's lineage and their heritage will go, to see in future generations if they'll be dwarfs or regular sized people.
Exactly, yeah. It's basically, just studying the genes. He wants to know how, certain traits are passed on. But obviously he's doing this in an unethical manner. So I have some questions for you guys about the experiments. So although to most of us the experiment is inhumane, if you had the frame of mind that what you were experimenting on was not human, does this change the moral implications of the experiment?
Well, that depends on whether or not you think non-human subjects deserve the same rights as humans.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on the person.
Yeah. So what's your opinion, though? I'm curious.
God. I don't know if animals are supposed to have the same rights as humans. I think there's a clear distinction, but I don't think that we should be doing things. I mean, you can't get animals' consent, so like, when can you ever not experiment on an animal? So you gotta. What? Exactly. So it's a matter of if it's to benefit like humans and benefit like humanity, then I guess.
The greater good.
Greater good, yeah.
So what approach is that? Do you remember?
The fourth one.
No, it's
Utilitarian?
Utilitarian.
Okay, good. Yeah. All right, so does the culture of an individual, the background that they're coming from, does that provide good reasoning for ethics? So in terms of this experiment, Dr. Mengele was part of the SS team, and so they believe, that the Aryan race was the perfect race. So then would that culture justify the experiments that he went through? Anyway. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in his mind, since he thinks that they're so superior, possibly because he could be trying to figure out what makes them so superior in order to like inflict it upon others. But then again, like they could also be false in that way because since he has a bias towards the race, he could also be trying to,
Kyle.
So, like what she was saying, from his point of view, sure, it could be justified perfectly because they're not humans, they don't have the same rights. But from an outside view, a more non-biased view, it's obviously very unethical.
Mm-hmm. Would you say objectively that it's unethical? Now, or does it depend?
Yeah, I would say it's unethical to force tests that torture other human beings.
Mm. Oh, yes.
I think Dr. Mengele's tests were more for torture than actual scientific. Although he did try to test the limits of human bodies to see how the German army could better equip their soldiers. I think it was mainly for torture rather than actual objective experimentation.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. All right. So what you were leading into actually was the motivation behind it. So you were discussing like, was it torture or was he trying to benefit the German army? So then, does the motivation behind experimentation affect how the experiment is conducted? Basically, what the experimenter is thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, it would, because if he's trying to do it for science and stuff like that, he's going to be more focused on like the actual effects, and he would be probably more careful with his testing than if he's doing it purely for torture or to really benefit the German army. It's going to do a lot more cause pain, and won't be as careful with that. Probably will not take the same like measurements or whatever.
Mm. So would you say that if the outcomes were the same, let's just say he experimented similar, like the same, even but with different motivation, does that change the experimentation's justification?
Not if they were not willing to approve the experimentation if the subjects had.
Mm-hmm. So it's dependent upon the subject's point of view and their voluntary or involuntary inclusion into it. Okay. Oh, yeah.
I was just gonna say that, like, for an experimenter with motivation behind it, they push past the limits of normal of the people that they're experimenting on, just because they'd rather they're so focused on finding the answer that they'd rather risk the health of their patient rather than stop and start over again.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, that's a good answer as well. So I assessed these through the utilitarian approach here. So basically, if the experiments benefited in the eyes of Dr. Mengele the humans, then it was justifiable under these principles. So according to utilitarian ethics, culture actually has like a big value, because in their culture it was viewed that we're trying to benefit these Aryan humans rather than these inhuman, like I guess he almost viewed them as animals. So then, because of his culture, it was justifiable because he felt that he was benefiting the most important people. And then in terms of motivation, just in general through utilitarian ethics, the ends justify the means. So as long as that same outcome comes out, the motivation behind experimentation actually has no effect on whether it was ethically sound.
All right. So the next real life situation is the Project MKUltra conducted by the CIA within the own U.S. government. What they were attempting to do What they were attempting to do is they were using different substances in an attempt to find a mind control substance, a way of forcing prisoners of war to give away information against their consent. They actually administered barbiturates, LSD, and other substances to unsuspecting victims at government-conducted brothels. They slipped these substances in their drinks without their knowing, and they were trying to see how this would affect them and how they would okay, sorry. So they're trying to see how this affects them and whether or not it would force them to speak. They were trying to find a truth serum, basically. And what they were expecting to find was actually never found. What they found instead was that the barbiturates and LSD were increasing the suggestibility of their subjects, and this suggestibility was actually causing them to lie and believe their own lies. So their hallucinations and the other causes from these substances was actually hurting their ability to tell the truth, because now they were believing completely false memories. And so here's a quick quote from the hearing conducted after the MKUltra results after MKUltra was discovered. They said the reports of the abuses of the drug testing program and the reports of other previously unknown drug programs for behavioral control underline the necessity for effective oversight procedures both in the executive branch and in Congress. So we see that you would think that from the last example that these sort of unethical experiments are only conducted by those who are evil, but we would generally not consider our own state evil, and yet we find that this was a complete violation of trust among the people, and there was a massive flaw, of course, and as we see, they were able to commit such atrocities to people illegally and still do it under legal pretenses. And so the questions I have for you guys: does the person who performed the experiment matter? And when you guys answer this question, I'd like you guys to see which approach you're answering under. So. Sorry?
If I were to approach it from the utilitarian aspect, the person does not matter. The only thing that matters is the results, which in this case would be unethical because the results were inconclusive.
Of course, thank you. And so the next question: does their intentions matter?
I think they do because that's going to be like their motivation.
So which approach would believe that their intentions matter? Okay. All right, anyone else? No? All right, well, would the experiments have been any more ethical if they were less secretive? If people knew that this was happening? Sorry. Eddie. Okay, and what approach is that? Okay, yeah. So would the experiments have been any more ethical if they had produced more meaningful results, or if they achieved what they had intended? Zuha?
Yes, because then it means like the sacrifices that they had to take were beneficial for humanity, and that would be utilitarian.
Actually, I think utilitarian has to do with the most good done. So I think it would be the teleological because the purpose they're trying to achieve is good. So thank you for the answer. So I'm going to approach these same questions from the teleological approach. For the first question, does the person matter? Of course, from the teleological, it's only the telos, the ultimate purpose, that really matters. So no, the ethics is independent of the experimenter. So do their intentions matter? Of course, yes, since the ultimate purpose is what makes the telos, what makes it ethical. So yes, the situation is ethical if the telos were to benefit the United States in its extraction of information from prisoners of war. Would the experiments have been any more ethical if they were less secretive? Well, no. Again, it's only what they were trying to achieve, not how they achieved it, that matters. So would the experiments have been any more ethical if they produced more meaningful results? No, because even though it failed to meet the telos, it was still had a good telos. The telos, okay, there was still a purpose in mind that they were trying to achieve, even if they failed to meet it. And that is what makes the situation ethical.
Okay, so for our final real-world example, it's the Milgram shock experiment, and many of you probably know what this is since it's one of the most famous psychological experiments that's gone on. And I'm just going to describe this picture because it outlines the experiment pretty well. There was an experimenter who was one of Milgram's assistants, and then the teacher, which was the subject of the experiment, and then the student, who was also one of Milgram's assistants, but the teacher was led to believe that he was just another subject. So the basis of this test was that the teacher was trying to obviously teach the students a series of questions, and every time he asked a question and they got it wrong, he'd be administered an electric shock by the teacher. He would have to press the buttons and he would have to administer the shock himself. And each time they got it wrong, it was increasing the voltage of the shock. So the voltages went up from just a slight shock that you normally feel, all the way up to 450 volts, which is actually can do some serious harm. And the student would obviously give the wrong answer on purpose so that they could prolong the experiment. And each time that the teacher got it wrong, the experimenter would have like a series of quotes. He would say, after the first answer was wrong, he would say, "Please continue." The second answer was wrong. "The experiment requires that you continue." The third time they got it wrong, "It is absolutely necessary that you continue." And then finally, he said, "You have no other option but to continue. It is absolutely necessary." So you can see how this experiment was kind of deceiving, how the teacher thought they were actually harming another person that was voluntary to do this. But In reality, they weren't. So his intentions, he wanted to see how far people were willing to go to follow a figure of authority, because he was, I don't want to say inspired, but he was interested to know why the Nazis were willing to go to such extent to harm the Jews and the prisoners of war that they collected. And so he wanted to see how far people were willing to go to follow directions, basically. And then in his experiments, I have some stats here. 65% of the people went to the highest level of volts, which is 450 volts. So that's a pretty big majority that were willing to follow directions from a figure of authority all the way up to a point where they knew it would cause physical harm. So that's the key point there. And then everyone went to the third highest level, which was 300 volts, which is still pretty high. So everyone was able to go up to a point where they knew they were causing some harm to the student, or the student, if you want to say. And yes?
Did they see the student get shocked, or?
No, they were separated by a wall. And so he had 18 different variations of the experiment, so I'm sure in some of them they were able to see them get shocked. And of course it was just acting if they did.
Yeah.
So in the 18 different experiments, he changed the situation, which is the independent variable, and then just observing the effects, or how far they were willing to go, which is the dependent variable. And then this is just a concluding quote that he found. Ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of killing an innocent human being. Obedience to authority is ingrained in us all from the way we are brought up. So the whole thing he was trying to find was basically in this quote right here, and he was correct. He thought that people were willing to go he was willing to go up to a point to harm another human being, even if they're innocent, just to follow directions, which is kind of what we were trying to get at from our activity. We were trying to see how far you guys were willing to go, even if you didn't know how hot these were or how much harm they would do. We were just trying to see how far you guys were willing to go to gain the knowledge, or gain the grade in this case. And I think a short video.
Yeah. So we have time for a short video. This is from a documentary on Milgram's shock experiment itself, and this is, I think, actual footage from the experiment.
He set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
You open those and tell me which of you is which, please. Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right ahead.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor, and the so-called shocks hummed.
You gotta get a shot. 180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man, eh? I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next was slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow, man. I don't get no answer. He was hollering a less voltage. Can't you check in to see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
Okay, so from the outline that the video gave you and what I gave you, I have some questions. And like Luis and Christian's questions, I want you to answer them from the 4 schools of ethical thought that we outlined earlier. The first one is the experiment any less wrong if no one is injured? Okay.
I think the ethical implications come with the lie, so I would approach it from the deontologist point of view, and that because they lied, it's wrong no matter what the circumstances were.
Okay, very good. Anyone else? All right. So based on the 4 types of ethical perspectives, how is this experiment ethical or unethical? So give me one of the 4 and then explain from that perspective why is it ethical or unethical. Eddie? Okay. Yeah.
From that point of view, it would be ethical because they had a good goal in learning in mind when they did the experiment.
So what about it that they were trying to learn that made it ethical? What was the goal that they were trying to achieve that you think
They were
makes it
trying
ethical?
to look into the habits of, normally good people and see how they act under authority, which would be a good thing to study because then it would give more motive and insight into the Nazi Germans and future conflicts.
Okay, so by understanding the past, you think that knowledge is very valuable, and since no one's in it, do you think that's still okay? Yeah. Okay.
That's a good answer. Thank you. And the last question is, how does intentionally placing the subject in a stressful situation and the use of deception affect the morality of the experiment? So in this experiment, they were deceived. They were led to believe that they were harming and potentially giving a fatal electric shock to another person. How does that affect the morality?
They made them think that they basically killed the other guy that was with them. So, I mean, I would assume that would have some pretty bad, that would mess them up pretty badly for, although stress and manic, stuff like that, I suppose. So, I would say that's definitely unethical.
And what one of the 4 schools of thought? Okay. There's another one? Yeah.
I think looking at it from the teacher's perspective, we obviously saw in the video how he didn't want to do it, he wanted to stop doing it, and so that stress in that situation that caused him to think from his perspective that it was not moral and unethical for him, but for some reason, I don't know why, but he kept doing it because he was told to. So I'm not quite sure what I think. I believe that would be one of the first.
Okay, I think it's like the
Utilitarian?
Yeah, okay. Like the medical technically it wouldn't be wrong because they're trying to figure out how far a person would go, so it's like basically benefiting the entire population by by seeing like how far that person will go.
Yes.
Yeah, I would disagree with that because I don't feel that anyone really gains from this experiment. Because I don't think that, I don't think that there's a majority here to gain from this by any means. I mean, what's the point, really? We know something more about the human psyche, but at the same time, we know it's at the expense of multiple different people.
But think about it, if you're trying to better understand Nazi Germany, then it makes sense. Because if you want to know why they did what they did, so in order for you to understand that, you need to be able to think like them. So you have to go and well, it basically makes sense because you're trying to figure out what they did and why they did it, and to what extent it's true.
Okay, keep in mind that this experiment was done under Milgram's own intentions. Like, he was the one who wanted to figure this out. I'm not sure if anyone else wanted to, but this was his own doing. He was the one who wanted to figure it out. Yes?
I don't think there was necessarily a net gain to argue it in a positive light in a consequentialist or utilitarian. And I think you can argue it in a positive light for T-Lux. Because they were exploring, human psychology. They had a reason why. And if you were to justify it, I think that's the school of thought that you would use.
Okay.
Okay, and back to utilitarian which we were discussing. So the pain experienced by these people, the stress that was induced on them, you think was less valuable than information produced? Did you say?
Wait, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
The information they produced, you're saying, is more valuable than the stress and the harm they did to the subjects. That's what you're saying, right?
Well, yeah, because technically people die, information doesn't.
That's an interesting point. To expand on what she's saying, that stress was temporary because I'm sure after the tests were concluded, they told the subjects, whereas the insight gained on the entire human psyche, that will last as long as.
See, that sounds better. That's
knowledge
what I meant.
I just wanted to hear you guys explain.
Yes, that's good. So I answered these questions from a consequentialist view, which was kind of what Natalia was hitting on. And it's basically, although the subjects were put in a stressful situation and they were deceived, no one was physically harmed, and the studies could be argued to be beneficial for the study of obedience. And this is, in the consequentialist view, it's all about the context of the situation. No one got hurt, and then there was
a gain of knowledge. So from a consequentialist view, this could be argued that this is an ethical experiment since in context no one got hurt. Okay, and kind of like wrapping this all up, in today's psychology there's a standard of ethical code basically by the American Psychological Association. And this helps people perform psychological experiments and evaluations of people under what is really basically a utilitarian ethical code, since it was going to help all the masses. And there are five main principles of the ethical code: beneficence and non-maleficence, fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect for people's rights and dignity. I'm going to outline these real quick. They're pretty self-explanatory, but just a little bit more on them. So for beneficence and non-maleficence, it's basically they're trying to benefit the subjects in the end and solve conflicts, or in fact avoid conflicts, in a way that they cause little harm to the subjects. And they're also, in this, the first principle, it's about not misusing their power like Milgram did, where basically don't deceive them. And fidelity and responsibility is all about developing trust with your subjects, and to be aware of your professional and scientific responsibilities. So your responsibilities as science and professional is to find your knowledge and, in this case, do it ethically correct without doing any harm. And then finally for that one, you're trying to avoid things that would emotionally / physically harm people. And for integrity, it's promoting justice, or promoting accuracy and truthfulness. You can't steal, cheat, fraud, stuff like that. And their own perception, the psychologist's own perception, should only be used if necessary. And justice is pretty self-explanatory. Their own beliefs should not result in unjust practices. And finally, respect for people's rights and dignity is, I don't really need to explain that one. You just respect them. And so basically, in order to have what society would believe to be an ethically correct experiment, you basically need to outline all these guidelines. And here's a quote from the American Psychological Association. Psychologists are committed to increasing scientific and professional knowledge of behavior and people's understanding of themselves and others, and to the use of such knowledge to improve the condition of individuals, organizations, and society. Psychologists respect and protect civil and human rights and the essential importance of freedom, inquiry, and expression in research, teaching, and publication. And another important thing, that these are just guidelines. You don't really have to follow them. It's not like a set-in-stone rules, but in order for you to get your experiment approved or looked at from an ethically correct way, it's good to follow these guidelines.
All right, so basically in conclusion, we were supposed to assess the value of life and the various dilemmas that happen when you're assessing the value of life. How can you assign value to life, and when does knowledge surpass that value? So we were also supposed to look at the various perspectives that we can assess these dilemmas that arise, deontological, utilitarian, teleological, consequentialist. And overall, we should basically, the point of this presentation was to show the difficulty in assigning value to life and determining ethical justification in general.